Let's jump right into this explainer and uncover the fascinating and, honestly, often misunderstood roots of one of the absolute most powerful historical figures of the 20th century. When we hear the name Malcolm X, we usually just immediately picture the fiery orator, right? The uncompromising leader, the man who quite literally shook the foundations of American society. But how did he become that man? Well, today we're going to explore the opening chapters of the Autobiography of Malcolm X to trace the precise, deeply personal events that forged his entire worldview.
Now, journalist M.S. Handler, who actually wrote the introduction to the autobiography, recounted a time Malcolm X visited his home. Handler's wife later described the experience with this just incredible phrase. She said it was like having tea with a Black Panther. Handler noted that it perfectly captured the mesmerizing, almost dangerous aura of the fully formed Malcolm X. He describes him as having the physical bearing and the inner self-confidence of a born aristocrat, but with this dangerous, undeniable power.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that we first need to understand his incredible duality, something Handler so astutely pointed out. In private, Handler found him to be courteous, incredibly gentle, and living this impeccably disciplined, puritanical lifestyle. He had completely purged himself of the vices that plagued the streets. But publicly, he was a fierce leader who struck terror into white audiences by just refusing to compromise. He presented himself as an implacable foe of the establishment, someone completely, unreservedly committed to the liberation, not just the integration, mind you, but the liberation of Black people.
But to really grasp how this Black Panther was forged, we've got to rewind the clock. We have to look way past the confident national spokesman and examine the cascading events of his youth. The foundation of his unyielding stance was really laid in the crucible of a deeply, deeply traumatic childhood. Let's look at exactly what happened.
Section 1. A Childhood Nightmare.
Malcolm's earliest years were defined by just relentless, devastating blows. Before he was even born, in 1925, Ku Klux Klan riders surrounded his parents' home in Omaha, threatening his pregnant mother just because of his father's civil rights preaching. Then, by 1929, a local hate society called the Black Legion literally burned their family home to the ground in Lansing, Michigan, while white police and firemen just stood around and watched. And then the ultimate tragedy hit in 1931. His father was brutally murdered, his skull was crushed before his body was laid across streetcar tracks to be cut in half. That is a level of trauma that would shatter anyone's innocence, and it left his mother widowed with 8 children.
And the trauma wasn't just external, it permeated the dynamics right inside their home. Malcolm's mother was very light-skinned. She was born to a white father who had raped her mother, and Malcolm inherited this lighter complexion. Now, even though his father was fiercely proud of his blackness, the psychological brainwashing of white society was so deep that it dictated Malcolm was actually favored by his father for his lighter skin. On the flip side, he was often punished way more harshly by his mother for that exact same reason. So he was learning about the arbitrary, divisive power of color way before he could even properly understand what it meant.
Section 2. A Family Torn Apart.
So the physical violence from hate groups actually wasn't the final blow for the Little family. Instead, state welfare workers, people who were ostensibly supposed to be helping them, systematically dismantled his mother's pride and the family's unity with just cold, bureaucratic cruelty. After the father's death, the family plunged into poverty. The state welfare workers started visiting, and they treated the family like their own private property. Get this, when a neighbor offered them pork, his mother refused because of her strict Seventh-day Adventist religious diet. The welfare workers literally called her crazy for refusing food. They began pulling the kids aside, planting seeds of division, asking who was smarter, just constantly meddling. And this immense psychological pressure eventually led to his mother suffering a complete breakdown. She was institutionalized, and the kids were ripped apart and sent to different foster homes.
Years later, Malcolm reflected on these welfare workers with a pretty devastating realization. He said, in their eyesight, we were just things. That was all. He learned incredibly early on that the system didn't view them as human beings with dignity or agency or rights. They were just case numbers. And this realization permanently scarred his view of society and planted a deep, foundational mistrust of state institutions.
Section 3. The Mascot of Mason.
Following the total destruction of his family, Malcolm was sent to a detention home in Mason, Michigan. He lived with a white couple, the Swerlins, who ran the place. They fed him well, gave him his own room, and treated him kindly. But here's the catch: he was merely a mascot. Basically, a person treated kindly, kind of like a pet, but never actually viewed as a true human being with equal intellect or sensitivity. They would sit around discussing politics and use horrific racial slurs right in front of him. And the wild part is, they didn't do it out of active malice toward him specifically. It was something much more insidious.
They talked around him the exact same way you might talk around a pet canary or a pedigreed pup, completely failing to recognize his humanity.
Now, Malcolm was highly intelligent. He was incredibly popular at the local, predominantly white junior high school. I mean, he was even elected the 7th grade class president. But as he matured, he realized a terrifying truth. He noted that even though they appeared to have opened the door, it was still closed. His popularity? It was just a novelty. At school dances, there was this unspoken physical barrier. He wasn't supposed to dance with the white girls. He was a mascot, guys, not an equal.
Section 4. The limits of ambition. This whole illusion of integration finally came to a head in an English classroom. Malcolm was one of the smartest kids in his class. One day, his English teacher, Mr. Ostrovsky, who had actually been pretty encouraging up to this point, asked him about his career plans. When Malcolm told his teacher he wanted to be a lawyer, Mr. Ostrovsky's response was just devastating. He said, "A lawyer? That's no realistic goal for a nigger. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" What makes this so piercing is that Ostrovsky was actively encouraging white students with much lower grades to become teachers or veterinarians. But for Malcolm, the kid at the absolute top of his class, well-meaning white society had decided his ceiling was manual labor.
So we really have to ask ourselves, what happens to a brilliant, ambitious child when society explicitly tells him his intellect just doesn't matter? How do you process being told that the color of your skin completely negates your hard work and natural intelligence? Well, for Malcolm, something inside him fundamentally shifted. He just stopped trying to fit in. He withdrew completely from the white people around him, sensing the absolute hypocrisy of his entire environment.
Section 5. Discovering Real Boston. This massive disillusionment eventually prompted him to move to Boston to live with his older half-sister Ella. And Ella was an absolute revelation to him. She was jet black, incredibly proud, she owned her own property, and she commanded respect. In Boston's Roxbury neighborhood, Malcolm observed a really stark contrast. On one hand, you had the Hill Negroes. These were people who acted elite, they prided themselves on imitating white culture and walked around like diplomats, even though most of them worked as janitors, maids, or errand boys. But on the other hand, down the hill in the town ghetto, he found an authentic, relaxed community deeply rooted in vibrant black culture, complete with jazz clubs, neon lights, and just genuine self-expression.
And this brings us to the ultimate turning point of his early years. Moving to Boston was profound for him. For the absolute first time, he saw proud, independent black people who weren't just surviving, they were actually living. He looked at the brainwashed middle-class elites up on the hill who were begging for white acceptance, and he completely rejected that path. Instead, he felt an immediate, magnetic connection to the working-class black masses down in the ghetto. He realized that the middle-class illusion he'd been striving for back in Michigan as the mascot, well, it was a complete trap. Yet, despite a childhood practically designed by a hostile society to crush his spirit, strip him of his humanity, and destroy his family, Malcolm did not lose his capacity for profound love. In the dedication of his autobiography, he wrote, "To my beloved wife Betty, and to our children whose understanding and whose sacrifices made it possible for me to do my work." You see, he grew into a man of deep devotion, grounding his incredibly explosive public life in a strong foundation of family love. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. How exactly did the intense pain of his youth, the murder of his father, the institutionalization of his mother, that completely deceptive mascot integration, and the crushing of his childhood dreams, how did all of that provide the precise fuel needed to build the implacable Black Panther that history remembers? These foundational chapters of his life absolutely prove that Malcolm X was not born out of thin air. He was actively forged in the fires of an uncompromising American reality.